Hello guys, welcome to the channel. Welcome back if you are a regular viewer. I'm sorry I haven't uploaded a video in a week or so. I was on holiday a week or so ago and then been really busy with work and other things. However, in this video I'd like to show you the progress I've made so far on my latest diorama. If you are a regular viewer of the channel, you may remember this Panther G which I built a while ago, and this Takom Stug. Now when I built and painted those kits, neither of them were 100% finished, and that's because I always planned to include them in a diorama which would be set around the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes. The scenario that I'm going for is that these are German vehicles which are going to be disguised as American vehicles, in the case of the Stug as a M7 Priest, and in the case of the Panther as an American M10. Now this was a real operation. Germany did plan and put into action an operation to infiltrate American lines with disguised vehicles and soldiers wearing American uniforms. My scenario for this diorama is that this will be a field repair workshop where the conversions have been made to these vehicles, and that workshop is basically set up in a farmyard, a captured Belgium farmyard. So I knew this would be a fairly big diorama. So rather than cutting out the foam base at first, I simply marked out the dimensions with masking tape on my cutting mat. So a square diorama base with buildings on two sides. As always, I prefer to angle the buildings rather than make them perpendicular to the edge, as I feel that's just a better composition technique. I knew I would need quite a lot of space because I would need some cranes and similar, workshop tools and figures and so on around these two already quite large vehicles. In this example I'm just using the blue foam to represent where the walls of a building will go. Once I was happy with the initial setup, I cut some purple XPS foam to represent the buildings. I wanted a farmhouse in the sort of top centre here, with an attached barn on the right hand side, and then a separate barn open at the front running all the way along the left hand side here. Both of the barns will be open so we can see into the interior, while the house itself will be closed off. Here you can see I'm using a pencil to mark out some of the key areas of that main wall, so that will be our door there on the right hand side. So on the left hand side here we will have the join with the barn, like so. And then we'll have some windows on the upper floor, making sure they're above the roof line for that separate barn. I did consider having a door to the house but decided against it. On the right hand side we'll have a big opening here into the barn, and we'll perhaps later on have some sort of like a commander's briefing or something similar going on inside that barn. XPS foam is quite easy to cut. I find the best thing to do is to use a steel ruler, and rather than trying to cut through it all in one go with a knife, just make initially quite a shallow cut, then keep going over that cut until you go all the way through. And I find that the best way to avoid a jagged edge. I always keep these offcuts of foam as well because you never know when they'll come in handy. I decided to have a small passageway going in front of the house on the left side of the diorama between the house and the barn. So I cut a sort of doorway wide enough for a person, roughly high enough for a person, and then to get a curved archway at the top, it happened that my roll of Tamiya tape was just wide enough to allow me to draw around it, like so. And again, by having that passageway there that leads to an area off the diorama base, that gives the idea that the scene continues beyond the view. So that's how those two pieces will go there. Originally I decided I was going to have some windows on this long barn, hence why I've got the ruler marks there, but ultimately I changed my mind and went for a wide open barn instead. Here are the two main pieces of that left hand side barn. You can see what I mean there about that big open entrance. I will of course put some supports in there later on. and that back wall there to separate the passageway from the barn. To represent the wooden beams which go around and across the roof and the door, I use these balsa wood strips. I forget the size of them, but you can get them in your local hobby shop. Being balsa wood, they're very easy to cut with a model knife. A simple wooden frame was made around the large opening. With some angular pieces for the corner. That's a good reason to keep the offcuts because you only need a tiny piece there for those angles. I just cut these by eye, and balsa wood glues really well together with super glue. Another advantage of using this frame is it will help me keep those two foam pieces together. So I did put some glue on the join between them, but gluing the wood into place really kept them close together as well. I used a similar technique for the attached barn, although I wanted a slightly different style to suggest it was built at a different time. So in this case I made the timber slightly wider than the doorway so it could be embedded in the brickwork. One of the features I see quite a lot on buildings from this era is these larger stones around windows and doors and on corners. I'm sure they've got some kind of architectural name, but I don't know what it is. So I just sort of pencil sketched some of those in preparation for carving them out, and then carving out the smaller stones which will make up the majority of the building. I find using a steel ruler and a craft knife to cut the main edge, and then a carving sculpting tool like this to go over those mortar lines works quite well. You'd think that the ruler would make too straight an edge, but once you've gone down it again it just softens it up a bit and breaks it up, so it's not too bad. Perhaps the most tedious part of this entire process was making those stones, carving them into the surface. I wanted stones which were 6mm high, so I had to draw a series of horizontal lines, 6mm apart, across the entire face of the house and the barn. Then freehand the individual vertical cuts to mark the edges of the stones. I wanted to be careful here because in one of my previous videos when I tried this, I ended up with a brick wall that looked a little bit too much like a modern day breeze block building. So I didn't want to be too uniform, but on the other hand, my horizontal lines are quite uniform, so I couldn't vary things too much. However, I did find that by doing these vertical lines freehand and not measuring the distance between them, there was enough slight natural variation that it looked okay. And of course now and again I did put the odd double height thin brick in, or miss out a line or two and put an extra wide brick or an extra small brick or something like that. At the moment this doesn't look like much, and I think that's one of the lessons I've learned over the years of diorama building, is that things often look really quite bad before they look decent. So it's important to stick with it and follow your plan through to the end. Here I am again with my sculpting tool going over the mortar lines, possibly a bit too wide for 1/35 scale, but you kind of need that indication of depth. At this point I cut out 2 holes for the upstairs windows. I suppose really I should have done this before I carved in the brickwork, because then I could have done those framing bigger bricks which I talked about before. Into those window holes I placed the 3D printed frames which I showed you in a previous video. But still using my cutting mat as the planning template for now, we can see that our main farmhouse and barn goes there, and our older side barn and passageway goes here. Now, I was fairly happy with the brickwork, but it still does look too even, too uniform, just not quite right. And the main thing is we don't have any texture on the surface, it's entirely smooth due to the nature of that XPS foam. So to get rid of that problem, I took some kitchen foil, screwed it up into a ball and rolled it, putting quite a lot of pressure on, all over the surface of the wall. You can also push it down hard in certain spots to give extra texture. You do have to keep rotating the ball though, otherwise you tend to actually get the same pattern over and over again. As you can see here, that really adds to the detail, and of course that's going to really accept lots of weathering and washing really well later on. I used various other tools, including the end of my knife here, to push certain bricks in, again to give that unevenness to the surface. And I made sure I did the same on this side piece here, which is the side wall between the house and the attached barn. To really emphasise that that separate barn is older and is of a different construction, I went for bricks rather than big stones as with the house. So these were merely 2mm high if I remember correctly. And actually what I decided, rather than doing the entire barn in brick, I decided to do just a few layers at the bottom and a few patches here and there, and then we'll have some kind of plaster cover on the outside of the barn, which has crumbled away in a few spots to reveal the brickwork. And of course that was always my design decision to do that. It wasn't because I got sick of carving out 2mm lines. Here you can see that patchy brickwork there with some layers at the bottom and a couple of layers around the edges, and a couple of revealed patches elsewhere. To make that kind of plaster stucco effect on the front of the barn, I went for a good old favourite, my AK Interactive Dry Ground Terrain Paste. Maybe not your first thought of materials when you're making walls, but I found it quite useful. I thinned it down quite significantly with water and then stippled it onto the wall. I think that's quite a good texture effect there. When you're doing something like this, you have to be careful to get all of the small edges and gaps and so on. So for example here alongside the door frame on that inner edge. This individual brick technique was used more on the small bricks on the older barn. I figured since they were older there'd be a bit more variation in them, so I really went to town sort of pushing some in, breaking bits of them off, etc. And I used a foil trick over the top as well. I decided that the plaster wasn't really flaky enough, so I carved some of it away with a craft knife and then carved in the bricks below as if they'd been revealed. Now I was fairly confident with the layout of the diorama, it was time to cut some foam for the base and stop using the cutting mat. This is 10mm thick foam and the base is huge, it measures 15 inches square. Normally I'd be worried about a diorama this big because it's quite hard to fill it, and then you end up with a lot of spaces and it just tends to lose the realism. I find it much easier to make a realistic diorama if it's smaller. However, this is going to be pretty packed. We're going to have two main vehicles, lots of sort of farming equipment, bits and pieces, maybe a German motorcycle, some stores, some fuel drums, and quite a few figures as well. So this is going to be quite a packed maintenance yard. Next I wanted to make the roof framework for the attached barn. To mark out where the horizontal timbers would go, I used some thin Tamiya tape marked on my cutting mat again. I then cut some pieces of balsa wood to length, and I was able to make this basic structure which will fit on top of that attached barn. And then a triangular frame above that to hold the roof. I made a similar frame for the old barn. This is one of the unfortunate side effects of having your buildings at angles to the sides of the diorama, because each of these pieces of wood of course needs to be its own length. And it does mean the roof takes on a triangular shape as well, which is not ideal. But I still stand by the argument for making the buildings at an angle. To aid the initial painting, these roof components were kept separate for now. I did however use a piece of styrene to block off the back of the house. As I said earlier, that's going to be completely closed. And that also enables me to get an idea of the shape that will be required for that awkward triangular piece for the house roof. There's no point in making a wooden frame for the house roof because we won't see it. Again, it will be just completely closed inside. For the roof of the old barn, I wanted to use some 3D printed tiles like these. This is a file I downloaded from Thingiverse, and you can sort of intersect individual ones like so, although I think I might need to tweak the file slightly, or you can print out bigger blocks like this of 4 or 8. They don't quite tessellate properly due to the design of it, so I might have to edit that file slightly, or just look for a different one. I use some thin strips of styrene to put the cross supports on the roof frame. Again, I'm sure there's an architectural name for them, but I'm not sure what they are. And these are the horizontal pieces of wood that the tiles will hang off. For the roof on the attached barn and the main house, I wanted to use a different technique. Again, I wanted them to use the same tiles but different tiles to the old barn. And in this case I decided to make those slate tiles from thicker strips of styrene. I took these long strips of styrene and just roughed up the edges of them with my knife first to make them a bit less uniform. Then I spent a lot of time cutting individual tiles. And even with a sharp knife, this styrene is quite thick and takes a while to cut through. Again, I didn't measure them except against the previous tile I'd cut, so there was some natural variation in their size, which is what I was looking for. You just got to make sure that you don't make each one ever so slightly bigger than the previous one, because then by the end you've got a tile that's twice the size of your starting tile. For the main house roof, where we can't see inside, this was easy. I simply cut a triangle of styrene and then stuck my roof tiles onto it, making sure that I have a good overhang at the bottom and the edges. Since both materials are styrene, we can use normal modelling cement to glue these together. And here's the finished roof for the main house. Then I could just trim off the edges to straighten them up and we're good to go. So here's my base layout. As you can see, starting to take shape quite nicely. Let's get the vehicles in there as well. So as you can see, that's filled up ever so quickly. We're going to have some maintenance figures around the vehicles themselves, of course. The Panther is going to be having the steel added to it to convert it into that M10 lookalike. The Stug, because it was the ersatz kit from Takom, already has the extra bits to make it look like an M7, although whether it does or not is quite debatable. So what we're going to do is have the painting crew painting that now in American and US olive drab. Okay, let's continue with the building. The barn roof was a little bit trickier. Initially I was going to glue the horizontal slats onto the wooden frame and then put the tiles on, but the big challenge here was getting those horizontal pieces the correct distance apart. So what I did instead was take the horizontal slats and glue the tile pieces directly to them, like so. And then basically just make up a lot of strips of tiles like this. These can then be added one by one to the wooden frame and properly overlaid over the adjacent layers. Annoyingly, despite doing this randomly and starting with a half tile every other row, it did seem there were certain places where the vertical lines would tend to line up with each other on adjacent rows. But anyway, never mind. There we go, there's the barn roof in place, or how it will look. Now I couldn't really decide what to do about the main courtyard, whether I wanted that to be big flagstones or whether I wanted it to be dirt or what. In the end I went for a combination of the two. So around the house I started to carve some stones as a kind of part of the foundation of the building and a basic path around the house. This wasn't measured because unlike the brickwork on the buildings, there's a lot more freedom in terms of the size and the orientation of these pieces. The rolled up aluminium foil technique was used to give texture to those as well. I decided to go for a mud courtyard in the middle, but of course the big problem at the moment is if I add mud to the middle, it's going to be higher than the surrounding stones, which will be a bit strange. So I cut away the entire courtyard area. Then I cut another sheet of 10mm foam, 15 inch by 15 inches, and use that to raise the buildings and the pavement and everything up. That gives me a 10mm drop down to the inner layer. That's a bit too much. That's going to use a heck of a lot of clay or a heck of a lot of texture paste or whatever. So then I cut a sheet of 6mm foam just to raise that gap up a bit more. And it means I can mess around there with that 4mm of space. I was given this tub of Smart Mud from Humbrol at the Airfix Creators Day back in July, I think it was. It's an interesting material. I never used it before. My maths tells me that this won't cover the entire surface area because it's only 200 ml in this container. However, by spreading it very thinly, I had a good attempt at it. I wanted a bit of texture as well in the ground, so I cut up some like grass fibres. I've had these for ages. I'm just trying to use up some of my old supplies now. It doesn't really matter how big they are, but I cut up lots of these. Then got to work spreading this mud onto the base. It's a really funny material because it's not really like a wet paste. It's acrylic, but it's sort of foamy and strange. It's actually quite interesting to use. It does stick quite easy to a lot of things, which of course is good for the diorama base, not so good for my gloves. As I was spreading it, I sprinkled in some stones of various sizes and that grass which I'd cut up. Several times, because it was getting a bit claggy, I had to use my steel ruler to spread it really thinly. I'm sure a spatula, if I had one, would do a much better job. I must remember to pick one up. And eventually I got there and I got a complete cover of the courtyard. That was my chance to sprinkle on some more of that scatter, so the stones and the grass fibre again. And of course to try to get rid of any of those awkward sharp marks on the ruler and any gaps where the foam is showing through. It's a really interesting material this, and I would definitely like to use it again on another diorama. I'll have to get hold of some. Of course we also need marks for our vehicles, so I took my tanks and put those into place. One advantage of this actually is that the material doesn't seem to be that sticky, so I could put my tracks there into the mud and they didn't seem to pull up too much of it. We've got a crane there which I will show you later, but that needs to be pushed into the ground as well. And of course those tanks haven't magically appeared in that courtyard, therefore they need some tracks leading up to them and other tracks leading all over the courtyard itself. These are the big wide Panther tracks, but of course I use smaller tracks to represent other vehicles too. In terms of painting, the XPS foam, both the black and the purple, are really quite absorbent. So rather than spending lots of time and resources on airbrushing thinned model paint all over them, I first went all over the model, all over the foam, the walls, the buildings, the floor, with some cheap acrylic artist paint, giving quite a thick coat, but also trying to ensure it was runny enough that it would go into any crevices and gaps and so on. Once that was done, I was able to airbrush in some base colours. I didn't film the airbrushing, but I've used a light grey colour for all of the flagstones for the pavement and the barn floors, white for the old barn wall, where it's got the plaster on it, and a yellowy colour for the walls of the house. These are just the base colours and they're going to shift quite a lot and have a lot of variation added to them in the upcoming steps. At this stage I took some thin sheets of wood and added them to the side of the diorama to add a nice frame. With hindsight I probably should have done this before I put the terrain down so that the terrain could go over the top of the frame and be the edge. The roof tiles were primed with Halford's car primer and then given a coat of XF69 as a base coat. Then I used some Vallejo model colour acrylic paints and essentially painted every individual tile a different colour. I did this with just a mix of paints on a piece of foil, adding some water to them, letting them run and make their own colours, so that every time I dipped my brush back in the paint, it was a slightly different shade. And there we go, there's the final result of that. I think there's some good natural variation there, not too much contrast. As you can see, I use greys and blacks, but I also used a bit of blue-grey to change the shade, the hue of some of these tiles. And of course, once they've got a matte varnish down, they're weathered, they will come together a lot more anyway. I used a similar process for the flagstones on the barn floor and the paths. And again, any major strong contrasts will disappear later on. Okay, that is the state of my diorama so far. Clearly I need to do some individual brick painting on the barn attached to the house, but I will do that off camera because you've already really seen those techniques in this video. In the next video, hopefully we will get to adding some of the accessories like the window frames, the gutters, the drain pipes, etc. and then look to weathering this and adding some of those farm accessories too. The other thing that we need to work on is the muddy farmyard itself. And I need to think about this because although I've used that smart mud and it's going to be quite a dry texture, the weather at this time of year was probably going to be muddy and snowy. So I need to think about how I'm going to do that. Anyway, that's my video for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I wanted to show you my progress rather than spending many more weeks doing it before giving you an update. Do feel free to add a comment or a suggestion to the comments box below. If you like this video, there's a thumbs up button down there too. I'd like to say thank you to all of you for watching, and a special thanks to my YouTube members and Patreon supporters. I hope to see you in the next video, and until then, have fun modelling.